Good afternoon, everyone, and you are very welcome to the Scottish Parliament, to your Parliament. My name is Maggie Chapman, and I am a member of the Scottish Parliament here. I'm also the Deputy Convener of the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee, and I'm delighted to be chairing this afternoon's session. Welcome to the Festival of Politics 2025. I hope that you will be taking part in several different events over the course of the 3 days. But I'm very glad that you're joining us today for Action, Not Words, How to be an Anti-Racist Country, in partnership with the Coalition on Racial Equality and Rights. And later, I'll be inviting you to take part in the discussion as well, to ask questions and contribute. I very much am looking forward to our conversation, our discussion this afternoon, hearing everyone's thoughts and views. It is important, though, that we remember that whilst there may be differences in views, differences in opinion, that we treat everyone with respect. And as chair, if I feel that there are any comments or questions that are inappropriate, we'll deal with them appropriately. We won't tolerate racism or hate speech in this session at all. I'm very keen that if you want to, please engage with the online realm of Festival of Politics as well. You can do so using the @VisitScottPowell Twitter handle. I say Twitter, it's now X, isn't it? Or it's @ScottPowell on Instagram. I should also just let you know that this event is being recorded and will be available on the Scottish Parliament's YouTube channel in a couple of weeks. So in a few weeks' time, if you want to come back to something any of us have said, you'll have that opportunity to do so. But without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce this afternoon's panel. We have Lucian Seddon-Foster, who is Research and Policy Officer at that Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights. He specialises in using equalities data to investigate how structural racism shapes the experiences and outcomes of Black and minority ethnic communities in Scotland. Lucian uses this evidence to inform policy development processes to ensure that anti-racist approaches are embedded within public policy. Professor Nasser Mir is Professor of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Glasgow. He is author of The Cruel Optimism of Racial Justice, and is co-investigator of the impacts of the pandemic on ethnic and racialised groups in the UK, and principal investigator of the governance and local integration of migrants and Europe's refugees. Next, we have Christina Tunty, who leads the research for the Welsh charity Race Equality First. She was the lead author of the 2024 Welsh Civil Society report to the UN Committee for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Her current research, in partnership with Cardiff University, seeks to understand why so few hate crimes result in prosecution. And we have Riaz Hassan, who leads the Welsh Government's Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan. With 27 years of experience in social development, anti-racism and equity-driven policy, he has held leadership roles in government and the third sector. He holds postgraduate qualifications in social anthropology and an MSc in social development, planning and management. So please join me in welcoming our panel this afternoon. You're all very welcome, and thank you for being part of this important discussion. There'll be, as I said, an opportunity for the audience to pose questions in a moment, but to get things going, if I can ask, Naz, I'll come to you first. What does it mean for a country to be anti-racist?
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Maggie, for the generous introduction, and to Career and to the festival organisers, and to you all for coming here and being here on a warm day when there's a festival outside. I'm told that the Festival of Politics is a bit like the Fringe, with fewer jokes and more footnotes. And as an academic, it's the footnotes that really grab us. And the question speaks directly to a key distinction, because one of the ways in which you might think of anti-racism is to characterise it as being not racist or to be colourblind. And that's not what anti-racism is. Anti-racism is, I suppose, a doing verb. You know, it's a verb which suggests that there's some action that needs to be undertaken to either prevent or remedy an existing problem. and it therefore can be a legal approach. We can think about how anti-racism informs a country's laws in terms of preventing or redressing ethnic and racial disparities. It can be a moral argument in terms of, well, what's the abiding underlying philosophical character that we want to try and govern ourselves by. It can be a social thing in terms of, well, what are the social movements that have actually raised to a public consciousness the inequalities that prevail. I mean, in my mind, the challenge, I suppose, is in many respects to kind of reconcile a couple of those different strands. And it's to try and align, I suppose, some of the questions of governance in terms of how a country approaches anti-racism to data in terms of what information it generates and from whom that information is produced, alongside the prevailing culture. What's the macro story that a country wants to tell itself? And in this respect, you know, you could say Scotland's been on a bit of a journey, and it's not unique in that, you know. And one of the things I would argue, and other colleagues I'm sure will elaborate in their own words, is that whatever else being an anti-racist country is, it has to be about more than public administration. And it has to be anchored into the prevailing cultural repertoire of the things that a country values. It can't just be the technical features of good public policy. They matter too, don't get me wrong, but they need to be narrated alongside a prevailing story which will endure over time when governments change, political moods change, when personalities move on from politics. So that's an opening, I suppose, discussion.
Thanks, Naz. Lucian, I'll come to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think NASA covered a lot of it, where it's much more about describing the way of doing things in terms of being anti-racist rather than a specific end goal. The end goal is that we're working towards racial equality and equity, but anti-racism is the way of doing things, or the way of dismantling those structures and, say, divisions of power, and really, yeah, trying to infuse that founding principle, guiding principle of anti-racism, where you're protecting against the racially unjust systems that we know we have, that have been developed, you know, in the Western world for hundreds of years. We acknowledge those systems, we recognise them, and we begin to revise and redress from there. And anti-racism is very much the way of taking that part forward.
Okay, we'll unpick some of that in a moment, I'm sure. But Christina, I'll come to you.
Thank you so much, and it's great to be here today. I think when we're talking about anti-racism, it might be useful to start by asking why are we even talking about anti-racism? Because I think at the individual level, you might feel, well, why do I need to be anti-racist when I'm not racist? And I'm sure many of us here today will have heard of the term structural racism, systemic racism. And these are very important terms when we're talking about anti-racism, because they're not talking about individual prejudice. We're talking about how different systems and structures and policies and institutions can all work together and harm some groups of people but protect other groups of people. And then the result is that we see unequal outcomes. And we've seen this across many aspects of life. I think one example that illustrates this very well is if we cast our minds back to the pandemic. And we saw that minority ethnic people in the UK were more likely to die from COVID. In Wales, between March 2020 and July 2020, 44% of deaths among 9 to 64-year-olds in the Pakistani and Bangladeshi ethnic groups were COVID related. That was in comparison to 13% of white deaths. This isn't because of differences in genetic ability to fight a virus. This is because of things like unequal access to healthcare, being more likely to work in frontline jobs where you're more likely to be exposed to COVID, being more likely to live in overcrowded housing. Again, to pull out a Wales stat, we know that 21% of people who are in the black ethnic groups in Wales live in overcrowded housing. That's in comparison to 4% of their white peers. And again, in Wales, black ethnic groups only make up less than 1% of the population. Again, as you say, we will unpick that between us, throughout the session today. But for me, being anti-racist means recognising that it's not enough to just not be racist. It's about recognising that good intentions on their own don't necessarily produce equity. And we need to be active actively identifying, challenging, dismantling systems and structures that produce these unequal outcomes that we're talking about, with those that ethnic disparities in COVID deaths being an example of an unequal outcome. And for me, an anti-racist country is one where people's outcomes in life, whether that's their treatment in the healthcare system, their treatment by the justice system, their education, isn't something that is defined by their skin colour or their ethnicity. And an anti-racist country is one where everybody can feel a sense of belonging, they're able to meaningfully contribute to society, and they have an opportunity to thrive. Thank you.
Thanks, Christina. Riaz.
Thank you. Can I just ask, but first say thank you very much to you, the team, and all of you for taking the time to come and spend the afternoon with us. I know everyone is really, really busy, but it shows the kind of the interest that you have, and I'm really, really grateful. It feels like I'm somewhere where we will have a really nice afternoon, hopefully. For me, when we started the journey in Wales, that how we become an anti-racist nation, and the vision that we set out for Wales to become an anti-racist nation by 2030, we set the vision that it's not just about removing racism, but it's about building a nation where everyone feels that they belong. When we're talking about Wales, the kind of the population, we're talking about 3 million people. So it's not like a big nation, but Wales is the first UK nation to commit becoming an anti-racist nation by 2030. But when we're talking about racism, it's not about the kind of the hate crime, which is kind of part of it. But what we mean is the kind of the system that deliver unequal differential outcomes for different sections of the communities. And when we're talking about racism, racism is about the kind of the institution that sets the kind of the messages where when people are there, the treatment that they have, the experiences that they have is kind of very different from within the same workforce. And when we're talking about the kind of the fairness, that how the system to be fair, where they deliver social justice, but again, it's talking about the leadership and the leadership across the whole of the hierarchy that reflects the demographics of the country or the communities, that how we can be a more representative workforce, or how we can be more representative political kind of setup, or how we can be more representative society, communities where everyone is part and parcel of the decision-making process. And again, that vision, the one we set out, people kind of asking, will you be able to achieve that by 2030? And what we're saying to them is, yes, the vision is bold, but it is absolutely rooted in people's lived experiences. And lived experiences is absolutely the key. Every single individual in this room will have very different experiences. And we just want to capture that, and that to become part and parcel of the decision that we are making in Wales. Again, it's the co-production, that how and the way we co-produce the goals and actions within the plan. In the plan that we have, it's kind of what is there. It's almost kind of say what is on the tin. And the last part is very much the accountabilities. So it's the governance structure that we establish, and that is kind of everything for us is the vision that we set out for Wales, that how we can become an anti-racist nation by 2030.
Thanks very much, Riaz. I think there's probably quite a lot that we could learn from the work that you've been doing in Wales on this, and I'm keen for us to pick that up. But I suppose before we get into the nuts and bolts of the how, I'm interested, Lucian and Naz, how are we doing in Scotland? Where are there prime examples of racism, I suppose? Maybe looking at the public sector, because that's where we know we've got data, we measure things. What is the scale of racism in Scotland? I don't know which of you. No.
Sure. So
Thanks.
racism is incredibly prevalent within Scottish society, but it's something that I don't think Scotland always highlights as much. It can be sometimes downplayed, but all we have to do is look at, say, for instance, where we do have data to kind of look at racial inequalities and the disparate outcomes between black and minority ethnic communities and their white counterparts. And we'll see things that rates of poverty, for instance, in Scotland are double that for black and minority ethnic households compared to their white counterparts, with more than 50% of black and minority ethnic children growing up in relative poverty. We also know, for instance, that BME groups, or black and minority ethnic groups, are 60% more likely to live in the most deprived parts of Scotland compared to their white counterparts, and that's something that's much greater among some demographics. For instance, people from African backgrounds are particularly overrepresented in the deprived parts of Scotland. We also know that for more than a decade, racial hate crimes have been by far the most reported type of hate crime in Scotland, and that's a figure that has not been going down by any particular measure. But we just have to think back to the events of this weekend, both in Aberdeen and Falkirk, and seeing that racism is very much alive and well on Scottish soil. But because we didn't have the riots in the same way last year, there can be a tendency to say, well, it's not a problem up here, it's, things maybe work differently, but where we do have data, it paints a very, very different picture. And even then, we've got a very limited evidence base to see that. And you just have to ask communities, and you'll hear very, very quickly just the extent and the scale of the problem that we still have here.
Thanks, Lucian. Naz, no, I want to bring you in next, but I wonder if in your contribution you could maybe address, why do we have that sense of exceptionalism in Scotland? Why do we think that we're better than everywhere else? I mean, on some reasons we are, but I think there is a sense, there weren't race riots on the streets in Scotland last summer. There were south of the border. And that maybe lulls us into a false sense of, we're not that bad, are we?
So I was going to answer the first part of the question, but the second part's so tempting. I mean, every country, every nation, every territory, every form of social organisation tends to think they do things a little bit better, which tend to be a reflection of them being more familiar. I mean, I'm from West Yorkshire, which we all know is the cradle of civilization. It's the home of English literature and art, and also, contrary to some erroneous claims made in Glasgow, the home of chicken tikka masala, just for the record. I mean, one of the things that Lucian was saying there, which is really helpful, is drawing the composite of what we mean by racism. So we can think of it, right, as events, flashpoints, incidents. And we all, kind of have grown up around and been witness to, from the schoolyard onwards, forms of racist violence, attack, and so on. But I think that the really interesting example that Lucian was drawing our attention to was the way in which it endures, right? The way in which it becomes embedded and normalized within prevailing social systems and then gets drawn across different sectors. So when we talk about why there's a disparity in terms of prison populations, we can't explain why more black men are in prison than their share of the population at large without understanding the relationship that has to schooling experiences, to rates of school exclusion, if not school exclusion, then school disciplining, which kind of takes them out of school to professional career pathways. And I think that's really just important to bear in mind. Some of the ways in which racism manifests is clear. Some of the ways it does is less immediately clear, but it endures, and there's a consistent pattern in terms of things like the pay gap, the fact that if you're from a black and ethnic minority in Scotland, there's a 10 percentage point on aggregate pay gap between you and your white co-worker, controlling for other things like education, class, and so on. And if you're a woman in Scotland, you get a double whammy because you get the gender pay gap and the ethnicity pay gap. And that's not an outcome of necessarily one person's decision in your place of work to pay you less. It's an accumulated form of inequality. Why does Scotland think that it's better? So some of this has to do, I think, with the fact of governance, in that for a long time, the apparatus around, and especially the enforcement apparatus, the things that we would call the statutory instruments, laws, and what's allowed within the law, were determined by Westminster. So Scotland would look to Westminster for guidance. I mean, I've lived, in Scotland for 25 years. My daughter, there's a very kind of strong sense of herself as Scottish. She'll bring home poems from school during, Scots Poetry Week, and she'll start telling me I don't understand it properly because I'm English, by which she's inferring that you can't do it as well as me, partly because I'm Scottish and I'm speaking to my story. Well, I think people for a long time in Scotland looked at their own society and they didn't see racism, no problem here, but also they would look to England and say, okay, well, of course you're more interested in questions of racism because you have more of it, And I think that partly reflects the governance structure, but also reflects a more radical politics in England to address racism and to forge an anti-racism, a lot of which has often been forged historically through violence and resistance to racism, especially the far right in our cities. I went to university in Bristol. I grew up north. The history of those struggles in terms of telling a story about what anti-racism became is part of, I would say, English identity, in a way in which, compelled through writers and politicians, Diane Abbott, Bernie Grant, Hanif Qureshi, they would hold up a mirror to English society and say, well, who do you think you are? I'm not sure that question has been posed in that same way in Scotland. Who do you think you are? And once you ask that question, you realise that it has a prior history which connects you to black and ethnic minorities over generations and time and space.
Thanks, Naz. We'll probably, I'm sure some of these themes will come back, but I'm interested, Riaz, you talked about the bold vision that Wales had to determine to be an anti-racist country by 2030, and bold, ambitious. And I'm wondering, what were the processes that led up to that to ensure that actually there's to use a phrase that I hate, but how do we get buy-in? How do we get people to come along with us on that process, on both the political journey, because it's always about power, but also about the sort of the identity bits that Nazi was starting to talk about there, but some of the other things, the practicals, the how. What is it? Was it that process of co-production that you talked about? How is it that Wales developed the strategy in a way that would bring people along?
Thank you. I think the way we've done it, specifically with regards to the co-production that I've mentioned, we kind of built the whole action plan specifically targeting lived experiences, and lived experiences become the core of our engagement. So that was the absolute key, where when we're putting the goals and actions on the paper, we engaged people with lived experiences to be with us on that same journey. And the process we adopted is we kind of gone through the vision setting events with the communities, and we asked them, if we really want to have a nation which is truly anti-racist, how that will look like and what that journey kind of entail. And the people, they just say there must be kind of stringent accountabilities. There must be resource allocation specifically towards delivering the kind of the goals and actions. They didn't want kind of statement, and they were very, very clear. What they said to us is that the government, the public sector, they're always good when it's come to developing action plan or strategy, but what we're not good at it when it's come to the implementation of the goals and actions within the plan. And you can only implement if there is a stringent accountability behind it, that yes, you have the goals and actions, but what if there is failure and people are not delivering those goals and actions? What would happen? How you will be holding those people to account? And the way we've done it, so one is kind of the co-production, but it's been monitored by we call it the external accountability group. And the way we've done the external accountability group, we have experts on anti-racism. So we have now 10 experts on anti-racism who are providing us with that expertise. And the way we were doing it, and I've mentioned kind of Wales to be a small nation of 3 million people, we were very aware that we will not be able to kind of have that expertise just within Wales. So what we done, we thought it would be better for us to appoint those expertise across the UK. And this is what we have done. So we brought in those expertise, a set of people around anti-racism to become part of the External Accountability Group. The second set of people that we thought would be better for us, that if we really wanted to be held as to account, we need to have those people who were involved and engaged in the co-production of those goals and actions. So we appointed 11 people with lived experiences. So people, community people who are really passionate about, some were really passionate about housing, some education, some health, some social care, some crime and justice. So we invited expression of interest, and then we went through, there was a lot of interest. It was really, really difficult kind of, to shortlist and then just bring 11 people. Initially, we were looking for 7 people, but it was so excellent, the number of people and the expression of interest, we kind of decided to move the number from 7 to 11. And those are the people where, and the permanent secretary, who's the kind of the most senior officials in Wales, in our most senior black professor in Cardiff University, they are the co-chair of the External Accountability Group. And that sent a message to kind of the people that, yes, we are the kind of External Accountability Group where we can hold anyone to account, including the government, including the First Minister, the kind of the ministers, so they can bring anyone to come and have a discussion with them if there are any failure around the kind of the goals and the commitment that we agreed to deliver. And it's very much backed by the kind of the ministerial commitment. So Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan as a program for government. And at the time when there was kind of coalition government in the first part of the kind of the current Welsh government, we were part of the cooperation agreement as well. And that clearly shows the kind of the political commitment, but then the official commitment where you have the most senior officials, kind of the co-chair of the External Accountability Group. And the way we done it is a very cross-government initiative, so it cut across every single policies area within the Welsh Government. So it's not just focusing on just health or education, every single policy area, and they have the goals and actions, and those areas being identified by the co-production and the engagement that we had in the very beginning with our community.
Can I just ask on that, if it is cross-cutting, and I think it's clear why it needs to be, how do you deal with potential internal conflicts? So, different government departments fighting for the same piece of resource, and how do you unpick that? How do you disentangle that then?
So the way we done it, when I said, if you're really clear in terms of your vision, that what you want to achieve, and if you do that in a co-production manner with the communities, people are very, very intelligent. So when we done the first draft of the action plan, and we shared that with the people, they said, no, this is not what we said. This is still a statement. We don't want statement. That's what's been happening. We want specific goals and actions where they are tangible, measurable, and we are able to do something about it. So then again, we kind of changed those goals and actions. And the goals and actions that been included within the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan, we had another set of discussion with our policies colleagues internally within the government that you need to include only those goals and actions where you have the political commitment in terms of resources and official where you can deliver. If you can't deliver, if there is no resources, you don't need to include those goals and actions. So we were very clear from the outset that only those goals and actions will be included to the plan where the resources attached behind the kind of the implementation. And we are able to do something about those goals and actions. And then kind of I mentioned the External Accountability Group, but initially when we started, what has happened in this kind of change, whatever that change look like, people don't like. So there was kind of resistance to change. So when we started, it was June 2022, where we launched the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan. But again, sometimes resistance to change is there, but especially when it's uncomfortable, and you need to involve and engage people in that uncomfortable discussion. And sometimes you need to make people uncomfortable because you're discussing something where people are kind of shy about. They don't know about when it's come to race. Race is an area of very sensitivity, and people say, what if I say this? Will I be politically correct or incorrect? The kind of the political correctness. So again, we wanted to have that discussion, the discussion that we have around kind of gender, the discussion that we have around, LGBTQ+, why we don't have that discussion around race. So we really wanted to have that open and honest discussion. And the way we done that, when we were kind of developing the vision for Wales to become an anti-racist nation, we established the values. In the values, there were 3 values. So the first one, we wanted to be very open and transparent. So whatever we do, we would need to be open and transparent. Sometimes it may be very difficult, challenging. The second thing, we wanted to kind of take the right-based approach. And the last one is the kind of the lived experience should absolutely need to be the core of our decision-making process. And these were the values that we embedded within the delivery and the implementation of the plan.
Thanks. Christine, I'm going to bring you in because your research has focused on lived experience and how so many individuals and communities are failed by, whether it's the justice system, whatever it is. How can we draw those experiences into policy discussions in a way that doesn't feel either tokenistic or in a way that actually gives power to those experiences rather than saying, you have your lived experience discussion over here, then the policymakers over here go off and do whatever they want anyway. How do we retain those connections?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think lived experiences is very, very important, and I think it's very important to listen to people's lived experiences and to analyse that alongside what the numbers are telling us, because if we focus too much on the numbers, we can really miss key things. And very briefly, before I follow on from that, I just want to pick up on a point that you made Riaz, around how that lived experience is built into the accountability process of the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan, and that being a key example of that. We know across the UK that people who are at the sharp end of inequality, whether they're experiencing poverty, whether they're experiencing housing insecurity, they are missing from decision making, and that has consistently been the case. When we're talking about how do we bring people into that, obviously there's some more obvious points around we need to bring people in and support them into more leadership roles, and we need to make sure that there's, when we're talking about elective office, there's barriers to standing, and those do need to be taken down. But I think something that can be done and could be learnt from and be applied maybe more holistically across the board is those co-production methods, by actually consulting with people who policies impact. And I'd like to just give a little example around sort of key indicators to look for when we're talking about progress and measuring progress, and why it's really important that lived experience is used as an indicator of progress. So, for example, if we're looking to see how, what's the proportion of minority ethnic people in more senior roles in the public sector, that's something that we can quite easily get data for to see. But are these people, those numbers could be increasing, but are these people then leaving the organisation 6 months later, a year later? If they're not crucially being retained in these roles, then, what impact are we really having? If we don't have an inclusive workplace culture for people to feel like they belong, that they can contribute, then they will leave. So I think it's really important to listen to people's experiences, to understand that this is still a problem, even if we are attracting a diverse workforce. That's one thing. We need to also retain people in those roles, and we need to support them to be able to reach their full potential.
And you talk about that sort of data capture that is meaningful, maybe 6-12 months down the line from where we might be collecting the data anyway. How is it that, are we actually collecting data that's meaningful across the public sector?
I think, I know that Scotland has issues like we do in Wales when it comes to data disaggregation, and a big issue that we have for Wales is that we're grouped together with England a lot of the time, and that can be difficult to understand those true Welsh experiences, and I know that work is being done in Wales to try and disaggregate those data sets. I think one thing I'd want to talk about in relation to that is that there is actually a difference, so slightly going off from your question, but there is a difference between minority ethnic people's experiences rurally and people who live in more urban centres in bigger cities. I can speak for the Welsh perspective, and I know that Scotland will have their own geographical issues here. But in Wales, we have our three largest cities in the south. We've got Cardiff, Newport and Swansea, and they're the most populated cities, the most diverse cities. And the data sets that we have in these areas can often dominate all Wales data, and I know that we do need to see sort of regional data, regionalised data across the board, so we can have a better understanding of people's experiences who live more rurally. So I think that's a big point that I would add. There. Let me just check if there was anything else that I wanted to add, if that's okay. I think that was everything. Thank you.
No. I mean, you mentioned geographic variation, and yes, I can attest to huge discrepancies in even how data is understood. If the region I represent, the Northeast, has two cities in it, but two very differently rural areas as well, and the understanding of what that means is poor, I would say, in public sector. Naz, you talked earlier about the double whammy if people of colour and women of colour would have double whammy of having the race and gender card in pay disparity. I'm wondering if we can say a little bit more about how we begin to join the dots, I suppose, to connect the information that we know we have, to identify the gaps that we don't have, so we can actually start to move towards a better understanding of the race problem that we have in Scotland and how it is perpetuated by the ways in which public services happen.
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is squarely on that. It's about data collection, which is currently mandatory, statutory, legally required, that is not done in Scotland. Incompletion rates for workforce data in public authorities is common. I remember
20% of the workforce we have no ethnicity data for.
Yeah. I'll give one illustration of this actually was when the pandemic happened and we were working on a task force. Colleagues from CRAR, Coalition for Race Equality and Rights, were involved in that too. We were way behind England in terms of demonstrating, evidencing the racial disparity in both infection rates and mortality rates. And at one point, we weren't able to tell you how many black people in Scotland were dying. Because the data wasn't linked. The census categories weren't sufficiently hardwired. They weren't recorded in patient records. They weren't recorded at the hospital. Sometimes that's an attribution that's required from a clinician. But that was one of several potential illustrations of the implications of not having not only the requirement for recording data, but I suppose a culture of completion and data collection as a convention within public administration. And until that is flagged and people mobilise on that issue, and it's the earlier point I was making about thinking about how we align anti-racism between governance, data, and prevailing public culture. That stuff's not going to resolve itself. But I mean, the example of Cardiff is brilliant, and the work that colleagues have been doing in Wales more broadly. It's that kind of bold marker. It makes a pledge that whether or not you think is achievable, it orients the conversation to do the work in a cross-governmental way, which gets beyond silos, certainly, but also elevates it in terms of political importance and ideally resource too. And, you know, Scotland does have an architecture in place for this, partly because of organisations like the Coalition for Race Equality and Rights, you know, working so closely with the Scottish Government, developing a 16-year race equality action plan, certainly race equality framework, in which data collection, you know, is a core part in terms of the focus that that has. But, you know, it requires to some extent a degree of normalisation required. You know, when political leaders, MSPs, First Ministers, flag these issues, as Hamza Youssef did, whether or not you voted for him, talked about the ethnic and racial disparity within the Scottish Government. Hamza Youssef, as far as I'm aware, the only non-white cabinet minister in a quarter of a century of devolution to Scotland. Are you okay with that? I think it's a problem. I mean, the fact that he went on to be First Minister and then resigned meant that, you know, there's no senior non-white person in the government. You know,
We have a minister. Yeah.
Cabinet?
No.
Yeah,
junior
not in the
minister.
cabinet, right?
Yeah.
So, and his other points about, you know, other senior equivalent public authority leaders. He said why, it got picked up, shared on social media, turned into a hate meme. Unless people are willing to be open and receptive to honest conversations, then we just circle back to the same old ones.
I mean, it's interesting that there's, and you're not doing this, but there's quite often the expectation that the person of colour in the government, in the cabinet, will take a lead on these issues. And we have CoCab Stewart, junior government minister, who is the Minister for Equalities in the Scottish Government. You know, what do we say about whose role tackling racism is if we're expecting the first Minister of Colour, the first Minister of Equalities, who's a woman of colour, to be doing these things? Is that a problem in just how we set things up in the first place? Do you think, Lucian?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, racism is not like our problem. It's something that we have to live with. Yeah. But, you know, if we think of the fact that we're here in the city of Edinburgh right now, one of the leading cities in the kind of invention of race as a kind of ideological concept, where you had figures like Adam Ferguson and Dougal Stewart literally measuring skulls and coming up with the versions of trying to split humanity into ways that could justify the mistreatment of black and minority ethnic people across the world under systems of chattel slavery and empire. It is, you know, within that context, white Scottish people who invented race, and now we are living with the consequences and the implications of that. And with that, I think, comes responsibility from white society, as much as you can try and call something like that thin. Clumsy words, I know. But, you know, there is responsibility there to take action against that. It's not the people of colour who are making race and racism a problem, but we are living with the consequences of a lack of action. And obviously, we have our own lives and livelihoods on the line to kind of platform ourselves and speak about race and racism when we get it. But not everyone who's a person of colour is an expert on racism. And you see very few, but there are some very notable exceptions, white people who are experts on racism and fighting really, really good fights. And it's that solidarity across the board that's really important. Again, if we look historically, we look at, say, the mobilisation against chattel slavery in Scotland, it was white working class people who were very closely involved in the abolitionist movement. That's a type of solidarity that is needed to counter racism at societal level. But sometimes that's left out of the discussion as it occurs.
I just add a paragraph on to that. And it circles back to your first question about why do we think Scotland's better. So the real paradox in this, to me, and every time I look at it, I'm still to some extent confused by it. I think I have an answer, but, you know, I mean, Scotland, minorities in Scotland, black and ethnic minorities in Scotland, very strongly self-identify as Scottish, make a claim on Scottish nationhood as members, as belonging, are very kind of forthright in terms of that, have clarity in their mind about who they are and where they are and what that means. It's really white majorities in Scotland, I think, who struggle to make sense of it, in the way in which I think white majorities in England did. I mean, Britishness today is not what it was when I was growing up. The Union flag was something of a menace. It's something that BNP members had, or NF members had. They used to have a flag and a racist dog. But, you know, I mean, so Scotland is in this position where minorities strongly self-identify as Scottish, make a claim on Scottishness, yet encounter the obstacles, including, you know, go to school, go to university, do well, and then face these kind of impediments, which aren't what used to be called in econometric language supply-side issues. It's not about skills and qualifications. They have those, yet they still fail to be appointed into senior and prominent roles, or they encounter deficits, penalties, pay gaps, and so on. And I haven't got, I mean, when you compare the experience to, for example, Quebec, Canada, minorities in Canada, they don't self-identify as Quebecers, they identify as Canadian. They have more, you know, their allegiance is to the federal state. It's not to, same in Catalonia, same in another sub-state we used to call sub-state nations. And so, maybe it's a lag, a time issue, but I think there's something else going on that we just need to be a bit more vocal and open about, which is the asymmetry. Other people, majorities, have to take ownership for this. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to questions in a second. I've got one more that I just want out there so we can have. When I do open up to questions, if you've been to any Festival of Politics events before, you know, because we are recording this, please do wait for the microphone. It will come to you, and you can then be heard. But just very briefly, we've talked about the Welsh strategy, the action plan. In Scotland, we have the Anti-Racist Observatory, which I'm really uncomfortable with that language. We're going to observe that thing over there. Anyway, Lucian, in your work, is that doing what we need it to do, or is it just the start of something bigger?
It's very much the start of something bigger. Since devolution, for instance, we've had, I think it's 817 different commitments made in national strategic governments trying to support anti-racism and promote, you know, race equality in Scotland. But there's people who are, you know, working, campaigning before I was even alive, who are still saying the same conversations that I'm having in their shoes now today. So there's clearly a need to invest in something that can live an institutional memory that can keep pushing that kind of sustained change over long periods of time. And I do believe that the Anti-Racist Observatory for Scotland could be an important part of centralising that process. It is something that is very much still being developed, but it's something that's going to have communities absolutely at its heart and ensure that lived experience that we've spoken about being so critically important is really going to be threaded in throughout. We know, again, with problems like the lack of data in Scotland, so much of the case is that we don't know what we don't know because there's no one centralising it to actually map where gaps are. Yeah. So having something that can kind of achieve that is going to be, I think, really instrumental to promoting anti-racism in Scotland. But equally, that is not a single institution that bears the brunt of carrying this kind of work in Scotland. And Scottish Government absolutely will still have its own, you know, responsibilities to continue promoting anti-racism within itself and for the rest of Scotland, as well as our public sector colleagues and communities on the ground and beyond.
Great, thank you. I'm going to throw it open now to questions. Please do put your hands up. I'll take this person at the front, and then somebody about halfway down there. Yep.
Excuse me, I have two questions. Is this on?
It's on. Yep.
What is race? I had a conversation with Sir Jeff Palmer, and he said, "Scott, what's race?" I said, "I can't answer. I can't tell you what race you are. If we're going to be anti-racist, I think we need to know what that is." Secondly, and this is also something Sir Jeff did, an action, is at the Dundas Monument over on the other side of town. Below it, there's an explanation of Dundas's role relative to slavery and how he prolonged that over 2 generations. And I think it's time for Edinburgh to put that not on a piece of plywood, but in a monument as it should be. Lastly, I think we should celebrate the appointment of Professor Tommy Curry at the University of Edinburgh and the 50-point program that he's taking forward there. But it's been a long time coming. So congratulations. I hear wonderful minds and thoughts, but to me, are we really talking about anti-color or color difference? It's a challenge, I think, to the white community and to me personally, what is race?
Okay. Thank you. We'll take the question from the, yeah.
Hi. So my question is about the accountability panel group that you have in Wales. I'm curious, what power do they have to hold people accountable? So if there are repeated failures to meet goals, is it a case of that accountability panel can only have a discussion with the people who are not meeting targets, or do they have power to enact consequences if there is a repeated failure?
Great question. Thank you for that. I saw another hand just 2 rows in front, which might be related, to...
Hi, thanks everyone. I thought this might come up because we are sitting in the Scottish Parliament, but since Maggie hasn't asked it yet, my question is actually understanding that we all live and work in democracies, and these programs of work are very important, but ultimately, they shift depending on what political change we have. What would each of you be looking for from politicians across parties in order to ensure that anti-racism is embedded as a strategy in both countries long term?
Thanks. We'll take those questions, and then I'll open it up again, and I'll make sure to come to you.
Great opening question.
Nice.
What is race? Maybe we should have started with that. I think academics certainly try and dodge it because we've all written books on this topic, and it just feels like it's page 1 of chapter 1. So, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I talked about paradox earlier. I would say when we talk about race, it's a paradox. Because what we mean is something which is socially constructed. It's not independently determined by biology or culture or character or any other kind of means of coming up with criteria. It's something that societies use to give hierarchy to persons within that society. And in some societies, racial minorities might not be determined as being so according to colour. There might be racial minorities based upon religion. When we talk about anti-Semitism, we're talking about a form of racism which historically has had very little to nothing to do with colour. Can do, but it has to do with the pathologization of a perceived religious culture. That was the same, in the case from the 1990s when I think many of us were coming to political awareness in the Balkan Wars and the ethnic cleansing. That wasn't a colour-based form of racism. It was a form of racism based upon an attributed hierarchy to the Bosnian Serbs and so on. So race shifts, but what is true about every category of race across time and space is the logic. There are different projects that come out of race. Some can be colour-based, some can be based upon perceived religious culture and so on, but the logic is about hierarchy, sometimes hierarchy domination, sometimes hierarchy and elimination. Right? So race is a social construct which has a common logic which maps differently across time and space. Professor Tommy Curry, Dr. Nikki Frith and others, I was part of that project too at Edinburgh when I was there before I moved to Glasgow. Brilliant work. Let's see what comes of it. They poured their heart and soul into it at great cost to them, I think, in terms of, the political toll these take on them. And Tommy is a fantastic advocate, and we're very lucky to have him in Scotland. He owes me, I hope the check's in the post actually for that. But anyway, let me pass on to colleagues.
Christina,
Yeah,
I'll come to you next.
I can't top that definition that you've given there, but I just want to add about race and that it is socially constructed, as you say. I want to talk about what you were mentioning of, is it anti-colour? And for me, I feel that it's not necessarily anti-colour because there are white minorities that are also racialised. And I want to just mention, because I think this group of people are often forgotten about and put to one side. And what I'm talking about is Gypsy, Roma and traveller groups. And I was wondering whether we'd have an opportunity to mention that today, so I'll quickly take that opportunity. just to mention that these groups, again, I'll speak for the Welsh perspective, they have some of the worst health outcomes. They have their life expectancy is much lower than the national average. Lowest educational attainment. They're disproportionately targeted by discriminatory legislation like the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act. And a big thing as well that we were talking about data earlier is that their experiences are often hidden in aggregated white data, where we see data for white ethnic groups isn't disaggregated. And we don't know, we don't know what their experiences look like. So I just wanted to pop that in there.
No, thank you for that. I think we have similar experiences in Scotland with our Gypsy Roma traveller communities, lower educational outcomes, health outcomes, lower life expectancy, all of those things. And again, a lot of unknowns because, as you say, the data doesn't disaggregate, or we don't ask the right questions. And there are some very, very active members of Gypsy traveller communities involved in different ways connecting into this place. But again, it's why is the onus on members of the Gypsy Roma traveller community to come to us to tell us what the issues are? And again, it's that power dynamic that's back to front. Yeah. Any other comments on what is race? Riaz?
Yeah, I think you answered the question. If you kind of take the census definition, so the census kind of classified everyone as kind of race. So white as a race being in terms of the population size in the figure. But the way I see it, I think, and when we discuss the kind of the race disparity, the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan, the focus for us is very much around the kind of the disparities, the disparity that exists within the society. And then is the differential outcomes. And the example, I don't want to repeat differential outcomes for many different sections and group of the communities. And you give an example, Gypsy Roma traveller. Every single disparities you take, they will be the absolute rock bottom of that disparities. And this is how, if we really want to be kind of a society where everyone really enjoy, then how we can tackle those disparities, the disadvantages that is there in the power dynamics. And when it's talking about the power dynamics, it's not just between kind of the white and black or Asian or other minority groups. It exists even within the wider society. So the power dynamics is very much there. If you take as an example, such as the kind of the gender, so gender even until 1960s, 70s, the woman, and the example I would give is the university, just take that as an example. So what happens is before Athena Swan, if you know Athena Swan is a kind of initiative within the higher education sector where they looked into the kind of the women and their representation within the leadership. And what they found is that it's kind of very much, white middle class men, they are within the leadership, but women, they were not there anywhere. And what they have done, they specifically started this initiative, Athena Swan, and with the Athena Swan, now if you see the kind of the women, they're still not there. But again, kind of, the progress, significant progress being made. And this is how, if you really wanted to see the kind of the system, what the system deliver. And if you want to make those changes, then what changes needs to be made for system then to deliver that or tackle that differential outcomes. We had an initiative in Wales. At the time, we called it Communities First, and it was very much based on the Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation. So there were deprived communities, and they were kind of the top 10%. So at the time, I used to manage the Communities First program in 2 of the local authorities area. And the work that we done, it was geographic area. So anyone in that geographic area, they were kind of very much in the top 10% of deprivation, and that is multiple deprivation. And then if you check the kind of the dynamics in the different people who lives in that communities. Again, the disparity was very different for different sections of the community. So this is how I can kind of see the the disparities which exist within the same kind of ethnicity or the same race, but you just need to see things from a different perspective.
Thanks, Riaz. Lucian, anything you want to add to
Just quickly, because I know there
Yeah.
are other questions. I think it's important when we're thinking about racialization to recognize that it is something that translates in sort of both directions in that sense. It is something that absolutely conveys disadvantage to some groups, but it also conveys power and advantage to those who are benefiting from processes of racialization. If you're racialized as white, you're going to be treated with, almost the benefit of the doubt, in the sense that people of colour are not always given under the systems where people are adversely racialized through, these systems. As I mentioned earlier, these were things that, ways of thinking that were invented to justify the harsh treatment of people living under the world of kind of chattel enslavement and the European empires. That history is not lost in the race that we have here today. And we've got to take that, I think, historical lens to recognise that racialisation is something that was invented for a very particular purpose. And by looking historically, we can then understand how that purpose is then manifested in society today, even where, new lines can be drawn in different ways, is very much going back to, as Nasser put it earlier, power as the central point of that. And power is something that, if it's taken from someone else, it has to be given to someone.
If I may, that's a brilliant point and actually links really well to the points that colleagues have made too. In that, and it's the hardest part of this conversation, I think, to have, which is for white audiences that are racialized as white to hear the language of privilege and think, well, hang on, I'm not privileged in my life. I've got inequality, I've got injustice, I've got struggle, I've got hardship. What do you mean I've got white privilege? And I think unless audiences are willing to reconcile themselves to the fact that their life isn't made harder by other white people because they are white, then I think the conversation comes to an end and turns into a politics of resentment. I think that in that space is where there's a fruitful conversation to be had, but it has to be an honest and sincere one and not a defensive.
I'm going to move us on to the next question about accountability, and I'll Riaz and Christine, I don't know who wants to take this first.
Yeah, I think the question that you ask about the power of the external accountability group. So I've mentioned the kind of the membership of the external accountability group, where the majority of the membership is made up of people with lived experiences. So we have experts, and they bring their own lived experiences, including expertise. And then you have people with lived experiences, and they bring that community perspective in the passion that they have in different area. And within the kind of the membership that we have the EHRC that bring the kind of the regulatory part. They are a member, and we call it the Welsh Local Government Association, which represent the wider local government. So they're there as a member, and then we have the Wales TUC, which is the trade union body. So they're there, and then from the third sector, there is a kind of body, WCV, we call it the Wales Centre for Voluntary Action. So they kind of make the wider membership. And the power they have is that they can hold us to account as a government, and they can hold us to kind of, the First Minister or kind of the Minister, anyone who kind of failed to come and have that discussion with them. And the way we do our meetings, we bring the different policies area, their leadership, to tell us about the commitment that we have within the plan, what they have done. So in terms of the kind of the delivery, and if they have any challenges, and how those challenges look like, and then what we can kind of help and support in terms of the way, if it's not delivering, then we have those expertise around the table. So we have that discussion with them. But the wider accountability that we have is this, that end of the day, we want it to be accountable, responsible for people on the ground, because they were the people who developed those goals and action. So within the implementation team that I'm heading, we appointed regional convener and convener across Wales. And the idea of those regional conveners are that they are the kind of the people who bring that intelligence to both the policies and to the external accountability group, and to inform us that if the commitment that we made within the plan making a visible, intangible difference in people's lived experiences on the ground. And this is how it works. So if it's not delivering, that intelligence coming back, and we inform the external accountability group and kind of the policies officials. So say, for instance, we have the commitment within health. If there are concerns within the communities, we bring that concerns back to the health. We have a subgroup, in the subgroup of officials, experts, and people with lived experiences, and they do discuss that. And again, if we really need to kind of bring it to the attention of the external accountability group, this is how it works. So the system that being established is very much at the end accountable, responsible to the people on the ground. And this is kind of the mechanisms that currently being established as we speak.
I suppose if I can just unpick that a little bit more, one of the, you talked about, challenges would be brought to the external accountability group. And I suppose challenges, some people might frame those as failures to do something, or failures to not do something, if that makes sense. What are the penalties? Is it that scrutiny? Is it that the conversation and obviously the exposure that comes from that, or are there other penalties? Because you obviously don't want to cut funding to a department that's not doing well, because that's not going to help it do better. But what are the ways that you can incentivize is maybe not the right word, but what are the ways that you can use that accountability to actually get a change in behaviour, a change in outcome?
So if I give you kind of two examples. One is when we published the plan in June 2022, we refreshed the plan in November 2024 after 2 years. And the reason we done that, it was very, very intentional. And the intention was that this work never been delivered. There will be challenges, there will be failure, but there will be huge learning for us. And the learning that we had within 2 years, we will refresh the plan, and then we will embed those learning within the refresh plan. And this is what we have done. So one example is, there is a leadership chapter, and the leadership chapter for us is that how the Welsh Government can become an exemplar employer. And the way we done it, we looked kind of the workforce, our workforce within the Welsh Government. And when we looked into it, we thought it's not representative. So if we will be asking the wider public sector to become a more representative, more inclusive employer, the question will come, what about yourself? So what we done, we appointed and commissioned an organization to look the whole HR system from entry to exit, that where we are, where are those blockages where we can unpick that people come, and where those blockages where it's not being delivered. So kind of we having the same type of people, but the diversity is not there. We just completed that. The report being published is 160 pages or so report for us, and we are kind of looking to develop executive summary, which we will share that with the wider public sector in terms of the learning that we have there. And one of the things that we have done, so all the SCSs that we have, the senior civil servant within the Welsh Government, we have asked them to have an anti-racism objective in their performances as performance objective. So when we do the appraisal, the question that they will be asked, that what they have done in terms of achieving those cultural change and the power that they have, how they are implementing that within the influence and the remit that they have within their area. For that, we have just developed we called it the maturity matrix. And the maturity matrix is kind of, and that's, I will be more than happy to share that. And if you visit the Welsh Government, I don't know if we publish that on the website, but I'll be more than happy to share that. The maturity matrix is such that you as a leader, if you go through it, you see in terms of your understanding, do you have understanding of anti-racism? If not, okay, you will develop your own understanding. Yes, if you have that, the second things, what you would do in terms of delivering against the commitments within the plan. And the third thing is for us is that kind of systemic, redesign the system if it's not delivering. How you can achieve that cultural change. And that is very much kind of there that we are working and helping and supporting. And the other example I would give is we're looking the whole remit later. So currently the discussion which is happening, and when we will be providing any funding, the funding that will be provided across the wider public sector, we will be asking that what you have kind of done in terms of the commitment within the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan. And the last example I would give, the money that we given previously through HEFQ, now we change HEFQ into MEDER, which is the higher education kind of bodies, and look the kind of higher education sector. And the funding that they will be giving this time, there is specific requirement of the funding that you as the higher education body, how you will be delivering the commitment within the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan. So the question you are asking, yes, it will be very much linked to kind of the funding, the grants that we are providing, and then there will be implication if people don't deliver that.
Okay, thank you. And then to the final question about what would you want to see in political parties, promising to do given the elections next year. We've got Holyrood elections in Scotland and the Senedd elections in Wales in May. Quickly, I'll go down the line if I can. What would be the top thing to deal with, to turn Scotland into racist, to support the Welsh journey to become an anti-racist country? What would you like to see political parties?
Well, to plug the area's own work, we've got the Manifesto for an Anti-Racist Scotland that we published just a few months ago, which outlines 8 key commitments that we think the political parties in Scotland can take forward. Those include efforts towards tackling racialised poverty in Scotland, efforts towards improving educational outcomes, including the tackling of racist bullying in Scottish schools, which we know is a massive problem. And I think there was a kind of point about kind of long-lasting systemic change that you're making as well, which I think curriculum change and tackling things like racism within school settings is a crucial part of that, because, we recognise that democratic will can change to different priorities at different times, but we can build that cultural change from the bottom, that a new generation can grow up without, say, facing racism on the playground and things like that, which will really, I think, lead to that broad sweeping systemic change, as well as all of the other asks that we needed. But read the manifesto, please.
As a plug for CRE's manifesto. Nice.
CRE's manifesto.
I think I'll keep it very brief. I think when we're talking about the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan and the ambitious goal and the commitments that are made around that, I think it would be good for it to be embedded legislatively so that it can survive election cycles. I think that would be a wise thing to do. I know that the talk in public policy, at least in Wales, on human rights and it is more common, but sort of that concrete legislative change to embed human rights, to embed anti-racism, perhaps not yet fully materialised. And then just very quickly, if I may, talk about the hate crime research that we're doing at Race Equality First. We believe that there are some really small changes that could be implemented to really see a big impact in change, in terms of supporting victims through their experience with the courts when they're prosecuting a hate crime. If you're a victim of a hate crime, you're often it lives or dies on your own evidence, and if you choose to withdraw your statement, then often the case falls, and that's where we see these really low prosecution rates. But if we can support victims through that process, if we can allow them the opportunity to give evidence in remote sites, so they don't have to worry about coming to court and facing their perpetrator, because that's a real big thing for them, it's very intimidating, then that can go quite some way to increasing those conviction rates that we're talking about. So I think there are some little things that can be done. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Yes.
I think the easiest thing will be if all political parties make that a manifesto commitment. That would be absolutely excellent. But what we have learned with the implementation of the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan, that anti-racism is not a checklist. For us, it's a cultural shift. And when we're seeing that, it is absolutely requires uncomfortable conversation. And we need to be ready for that conversation. It requires sustained investment. And Christina said, it shouldn't be just linked to kind of the 4 or 5 year cycles. And it's very much around the kind of building the trust over time. And when we do that, I think it's basically the trust and confidence of the people. And if people see that whatever we do, it is delivering the benefit, not just to sections of the community, but to the wider communities. And there is economic benefit for that. And usually the example I've given is if you see most of the big private sector organization, their board will be very, very diverse. And the reason the board is diverse is kind of you capture the kind of the intelligence and the challenge from many different perspectives. And the one example I've given, in some society, when I was doing community cohesion program, in some area, some of the small community, they were not very happy with the students' community. And I said, we never work and kind of share the benefit of the students. When students come to any communities, one, they bring the kind of the economic benefit. So the minimum fee is 20 to 25,000 pounds. And in some small town where they have a university, it's a huge investment in that communities. But the second thing, it's the kind of the knowledge that they bring. So you have PhD students, the knowledge that come, and that knowledge help and support us through our research, and we becoming, one of the kind of the nation or the country where we excel in that research. So it's kind of the knowledge gain, but then kind of the economic gain. But what we're not good at it, kind of telling that stories to the people that yes, there will be those kind of smaller issues, rubbish bag, outside. But sometimes when students come, have we informed them of on such and such day the black bag needs to be out, But we can do that with smaller intervention.
Okay, thank you. I'll open it up for another round of questions. I thought I saw.
Lady at the back has had a hand up all the way.
Yes, I saw equally one at the front, and then right at the back.
So my question is more aimed at Christina and Riaz. So obviously Wales has set out the goal to be anti-racist by 2030. Do you think having a goal, like a deadline, makes your target useful, or do you think that there's a risk that it just becomes more of a symbolic gesture by having such a deadline?
Okay, thank you. Question at the back.
Culture will eat strategy for breakfast. My question is partly based on, why the 2030 deadline. How will we know that you've succeeded in your goal? Organisations like the civil service, you will have a policy, plans, processes. It's the informal practice that you really have to look at. And how are you going to ensure, how are you going to ensure that what you're putting on paper is delivered in practice?
Thank you, great question. And I saw another hand. Sorry, right at the front. Just here. Oh, thanks.
Hi, I'd like to mention other points. What commitment you're going to do under the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of all forms against racial discrimination? Talk about Scotland and Wales, because any progress have not been made. What is the deadline? What is the planning? Are you talking about tackling this very serious system of tackling structural racism linked to the slave trade and other disadvantage for 533 years?
Great. Thanks very much. So 2 questions which are kind of linked. I think one definitely for Christina and Riaz, and then I'll bring the others in for that broader question as well, the strategies culture for breakfast. But Christina, do you want to kick off?
I'm happy to kick off with your question. So around, and it also relates partly to your question at the back as well, around the ambition around our 2030 deadline in Wales that the Welsh Government has set for itself. So undeniably ambitious, was widely welcomed by civil society in Wales, and as a stark contrast to the UK government in recent years, who has just refused that these issues even exist. I want to say that I do believe, and I think this is largely the opinion in the third sector in Wales, that we do believe that's important to be pragmatic around that 2030 deadline. It is only a few years away, and the evidence, and I won't go back into the evidence because we've talked about a lot of that today, and in the interest of time as well, but the evidence does show that racism is still deeply embedded in our society, and the experiences of minority ethnic people are still starkly different to their white peers. So I do believe that we have still got a way to go. In terms of, is it useful? I think it is useful to set that ambition and to continuously be held to account. And Riaz has spoken about how Welsh Government does that. And I mentioned earlier around the sort of language that's being used in public policy speak on anti-racism and on human rights, and how I feel and how we feel in the third sector, that perhaps this hasn't been fully brought to bear maybe at this stage. And I think one example of that, and it does relate as well to the third question around the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. In Wales, we have a commitment to, the Welsh Government has made a commitment to incorporate other UN treaties, like for the rights of disabled people, and as well for the elimination of discrimination against women. And there's been a commitment to incorporate that into Welsh domestic law. The same commitment has unfortunately not been made for CERD. And that does feel like a missing part of the puzzle for the third sector, and it just kind of doesn't really make sense, because it feels like that could have been some sort of underlying framework that could be an additional embedment into the accountability process for the RWAP. So I think that's an area that's still slightly missing. So ultimately, I mean, to sum up, I think that it's important to have that ambition, because we aren't just going to wake up on on the 1st of January 2030 and it's just completely gone, like this in the middle of the night. It's removed. But when we're talking about racism, anti-racism, it is this continuing education and continuing effort. It is constantly evolving, and we need to make sure that we're doing this work and changing direction if we need to, if things aren't working right. So I think that there's a continuing effort to anti-racism.
Naz,
yeah, well, culture eats strategy for breakfast, but it chokes on data, right? And I suppose that one of the things that people like me, I would talk about generating good longitudinal, complete data sets, is that it's very hard to make rhetorical or political statements and retain legitimacy amongst enough people, because obviously it happens, when the evidence points in the other direction. One illustration of that, which I enjoyed very much, was the fact that the Cabinet Office, after a long period, some great work, wonderful civil servants, some of whom worked closely with a number of us here, set up the race disparity audit. It has some characteristics which seem to be less ambitious than the work colleagues have done in Wales, but cross-governmental department sits in the Cabinet Office at the heart of government. It's, resourced. It's something that ministers need to report on. They need to generate the data sets. Has endured. But it was there when the government, under Boris Johnson's leadership, Prime Minister Johnson's leadership, commissioned, the Commission on Race, Equality, Disparity. It's called the CRED report. And they came out with some interesting findings. And we said, are you sure? Because the government data over here suggests not, And I think that's invaluable. I think good data allows you to have not only a conversation, but to correct the record. And so that's somewhere where I think that every space, organisation, government interested in anti-racism can labour, to hardwire the data from things which are generally core anyway, like census categories. That information is there, like health data. That information is there. Get the completion rates up, then pull it across, because it, allows us to scrutinise and then gives agency and voice to folk who are often, the objects of inquiry. And they're able to turn that around, as in the case of the Race Observatory, and narrate their own stories in many respects, which is another form of data which doesn't lend itself to being obscured or silenced by culture, which wants to eat strategy for breakfast. But I love that motif. Thank you.
Lucian.
Yeah, just to pick up on your point at the back as well, I think one of the really effective ways at avoiding that challenge of strategies, as I mentioned earlier, so many commitments have already been made in years past that have led to essentially very little. But what I think we sometimes have, especially when we're very good at the rhetoric, is that it doesn't translate into action. It's action for the sake of action or no action at all. And so I think meaningful policy evaluation from an anti-racist perspective is absolutely crucial in that instance, where if you can build capacity within, say, government workforces to actually be able to tell what the impact of their policies are on race equality, they can then course correct where things are working, or course correct where things are not working, and do more of the things that are actually leading to promising impacts on people's lives. But again, it goes back to the data, because in order to actually change something, we need to be able to measure what the problem is in the first place. Otherwise, we're just sort of shooting in the dark. But to then kind of loop into your point from towards the front, I think there's something about just having real strong leadership around things like ICERD, or the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, where they had quite a funny example where in the last year, so last summer, there was in Geneva, a lot of people from government and the third sector got together, and recommendations were made specifically to the Scottish Government, talking about the lack of data we have that can be disaggregated by ethnicity. I then sat down a couple months later with the chief statistician in the Scottish Government, who didn't know recommendations had even been made. And that just highlights the fact that these conversations are happening in so many different spaces. Left hands do not know what the right hands are doing, even within the same institutions. And until we can start to tackle some of those issues, we're really just up against the wall in terms of progress towards meaningful action on race equality, rather than just speaking the right rhetoric over and over and over again, sticking in the same kind of position where people I know who live longer than I do have, been saying the same things long before I was even born, and now I'm in their shoes saying the exact same things much later.
And I think there's maybe a point in your question that links to the question about manifestos and commitments to be made in the elections next year. So I'm sure that there will be people who take note of that. Thank you. We have run out of time, I'm afraid, and we could probably go on talking about the ways in which we tackle the issue of racism for a long time this evening. But I just want to say, do any of you have any final thoughts that you'd want to leave us with? 10 seconds, 30 seconds if you must. But Riaz, do you have any final thoughts? And I'll come down there.
I think what we would say is, kind of, for us, anti-racism, it's not a project. Kind of, it's a principle. The principle is that we really want to embed within the decision-making process, the service delivery, and the work that we do across the government. And for us, kind of, it's not a kind of performative gesture to just show that, yes, Wales will become an anti-racist nation. But what we are doing, we're kind of trying to build the future with our communities together, the future that deliver for our future generation. And we are able to tackle the disparities that we have identified through the work of Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan.
Thank you. Christina.
Add with a quick sentence. I mean, we've seen those bold commitments through the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan that we've spoken about today, but when the reality ultimately is we're talking about structural change, it's going to take time, it's going to take sustained effort, it's going to take sustainable resourcing, and it's going to take political will as well. So yeah, I think that's what I'll finish with, and just thank you very much for having me today. It's been great to contribute.
Thanks. Naz?
Receive the problem with openness, you know, be at peace with the fact that there are things like white privilege and they do play a role, hardwire the data. And I think there is a degree of alignment required, maybe through incentives as well as penalties, to make sure that strategies and policies are implemented.
Thanks.
I just think if Scotland as a country wants to aspire to be an anti-racist country, the first point is at least just acknowledgement that it is and has been a racist country in the first place, and that's something that we continuously have as a challenge. And again, it's only taken until the events of this most recent weekend that we've seen that racism is alive and well within our communities. And people of colour have been saying this for a very, very long time, but we've been gaslit and downplayed about that. But it is now on our streets, rearing its ugly head. And once we can now start to recognise that and name that problem in the room, then we can start having a think about how to be an anti-racist country. But there's a long, long, long journey in Scotland still to go before any such claims can start to get made.
Thank you very much. That's a powerful point and a call to action, I think, for all of us to end on, perhaps those of us particularly with white privilege. Can I invite you to join me in thanking very much all of our panellists for... It's been a very thought-provoking session. Please do fill out the feedback, the little QR codes around. Please do fill out a feedback survey or complete one of the paper ones. And please do come along. There are events happening for the rest of today, tomorrow and Friday on topics from data and democracy, AI, further discussions about racism and the impacts on journalists in war zones. So please do have a look at the programme, do come along to other sessions if you can, and enjoy the rest of the Festival of Politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you.